welcome to the John F. Kennedy Forum. Thank you. Good evening and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum at the Institute of Politics. My name is Mira Sholovar and I'm a freshman studying applied math and government at the college, and I'm a member of the JFK Jr. Forum Committee. Before we begin, please note the exit doors, which are located on both the park side and the JFK Street side of the forum. In the event of an emergency, walk to the exit closest to you and congregate in the JFK Park. Please also take a moment now to silence your cell phones. And join me in welcoming Harvard Kennedy School student Wein Macron.
Well, good evening, everybody, and thank you very much for joining us tonight. I'm Wein Macron. I'm a second-year student here at the Kennedy School, and I'm part of the organizing team of the European Conference. So as you know, 2024 was the year when the world went through the polls, and 2025 will be the year when first conclusions will be drawn. In this context, the role of the EU is called into question. Is it still relevant? Is it really coherent across countries and across conflicts? And will it matter tomorrow? To answer these questions and many more, we're absolutely delighted to welcome tonight French Minister Delegate in charge of European Affairs, Mr. Benjamin Haddad, for a discussion with Vincent Pons, a professor of business administration at Harvard Business School. So earlier in his career, Benjamin Haddad worked as the senior director at the Europe Center at the Atlantic Council. And in 2022, he was elected member of the French National Assembly and then re-elected in 2024. Last September, he was appointed Minister Delegate in charge of European Affairs. And so his extensive experience in transatlantic relations and European affairs will for sure illuminate key aspects of the discussions tonight. So please join me in welcoming Minister Haddad and Professor Pons.
Minister, it's a pleasure to be with you today. Thanks a lot for coming all the way to Boston, despite the difficult weather. I'm going to start with a question which I think is on everyone's mind, which is that the US has a new president, and this president is entering in a new relationship with European countries, including France. This is particularly remarkable given the history of collaboration between our two countries. Very dear to us in Massachusetts is the history of Marquis de Lafayette when he joined the Continental Army in the American Revolution War. Very dear to the French is the Marshall Plan when the United States extended a hand to Europe to help with reconstruction after World War II. But today, the relationship is changing. So my question to you is, how should Europe respond to the tone that President Trump is setting today in its discussion with European countries?
So I have 55 minutes to answer. Thank you. First, thanks for having me. It's great to be here. Anecdotally, I have to say, last time I was at this conference was, I think, in March 2020. And it was the last public event I did for 2 years. And we already felt a little awkward about being in a room with a lot of people, so it feels more comfortable now. But it's really good to be at this European conference. And you're right to mention it at a critical time and maybe a turning point for Europe, the security of Europe, and of course for the transatlantic relationship. And the introducer mentioned that I lived in the United States for 7 years in DC. I lived the first Trump administration, from the campaign to basically to the election of President Byron. And what struck me at the time was that there was, if I'm being frank, I think a lot of denial on both sides of the Atlantic about what was going on. And people, especially in Europe, convinced themselves that the first Trump administration was an accident of history, a break, that we would go back to normal, to the good old days of the transatlantic relationship afterwards, and we just needed to wait it out. And what we've seen is when it comes to the US relationship to Europe and the fact that Europe is not as central to the US mindset and worldview as it used to be, when focusing on the relationship with China, for example, and the security of the Indo-Pacific, when it comes to protectionist trends and the backlash against free trade, when it comes to the relationship to American internationalism, interventionism, alliances, I think Trump is also, to a large extent, an accelerator of pre-existing trends and things that continue to a certain extent under the previous administration and continue now. And the reason I'm saying this is because I think at the end of the day, the answer to what's going on in the US for Europeans is to take their destiny into their own hands, invest in their own security, their own sovereignty, focus on the challenges that lay ahead for them, and we'll be, of course, discussing this in more detail, but the competitiveness and growth of our economy, reinvesting in tech and making sure that we don't miss the revolutions of AI, of quantum, which is not only about the economy or jobs, but really about national security and sovereignty as well. Step up our ambition on defense and security, especially at a time where we have still at our borders the war of Russian aggression against Ukraine, which has a direct impact on our security, and give ourselves the ability to be united and have a coherent and common response. The United States is our allies, and you're right to, especially here, mention the long-standing relationship between Europe and the United States, between France and the United States, oldest allies in the world. But I think the best way to salvage that relationship and to rethink that relationship is to have it more balanced with Europeans who are able to step up and take more ambition and take more responsibility into their own hands. In a way, that's what President Obama and then President Trump, to a certain extent President Biden as well, were also expecting from Europe. So if you allow me to be a little optimistic, when you're a politician, you have to be optimistic, otherwise it makes no sense to get involved in politics. This can be a moment of opportunity. Not only opportunity for Europeans to wake up from this little break from history that they've had for the last decades, but also to rethink and rebalance in a more mature way the transatlantic relationship that I think can be beneficial to both sides.
So you mentioned Ukraine and Russian aggression against Ukraine. Something that has been very striking to me as a French citizen living in the US is to observe that under the Biden administration, the US was seemingly willing to do more and invest more in supporting Ukraine than Europe was, when the stakes are at least as high for European countries as they are for the US. President Trump has signaled his intention to send much less money to support Ukraine. Is Europe willing and is Europe able to replace the US in playing that role of supporting by sending weapons and by sending financial aid?
So there's a few things to answer your question. First, a victory of Vladimir Putin in Ukraine would be a loss for both the United States and Europe. It would send a terrible signal to the rest of the world. It would create a terrible precedent for international relations that aggression can pay, that you can redraw borders by force in Europe in the 21st century. And that's a message that we've been conveying to this new administration. You're right to say that the Biden administration played a critical role in supporting and helping Ukrainians defend themselves, although something that maybe we've not been very good at communicating, and sometimes it hasn't crossed the Atlantic. If you take on average, on cumulated economic, humanitarian, military aid, Europeans have actually given more now than the US. So Europeans have pulled their weight. I say this because it struck me, when I was a parliamentarian, I was the chairman of the France-Ukraine Friendship Group, so I've spent a lot of time in Ukraine over the last 2 years. And I went with a group of European parliamentarians to DC when the military aid to Ukraine was being debated and was stuck at the Congress. And we went there to advocate for releasing the aid to both Republican and Democratic senators. And it struck us at the time that one of the arguments we heard from lots of Republicans who were more skeptical about aiding Ukraine was that they were saying, well, you guys need to do it. We're defending European security when you're not doing it. And it would be a legitimate argument, but in this case, because we've heard this often about burden sharing and defense spending, but in this case, Europeans have pulled their weight. And rightly so, because once again, this is directly on the European continent. I was talking earlier about this little break from history that we've taken, and the Russian aggression was a brutal awakening, but I think from decades of denial. There's one phrase that we often hear that I hate, is when people say it's the return of war on the European continent. But the truth is it's never left. In my office, I have a poster that I bought in Sarajevo of a woman who's asleep when there's a European flag pin, so it's the metaphor of Europe, and it says, "Wake up Europe, Sarajevo's calling." And it's a propaganda poster from '95 where we had a genocide on the European soil, and we needed the US to be able to step in and stop it and get military involved. Then, of course, and at the time, there was this sense that it was sort of anachronistic, old ethnic hatreds, had nothing to do with the new world in which we were. Then you had 2008, of course, with Georgia. Then the annexation of Crimea and the beginning of the war in Donbass in 2014. And each time there was this sense that it was more of an exception than the rule. And now Ukraine. That, I think, has been really a shell shock to Europeans. You've seen increased defense spending everywhere. France, for example, over the 2 terms of the Macron presidency will have doubled its defense spending. A country like Poland is going close to 5%. Germany has been undergoing a major debate, the Zeitenwende, increasing defense spending, investing in capabilities. And of course, we need to do more to cooperate at the European level, find new ways of financing. I'll be in Warsaw with President Macron Monday, where we have a summit devoted to defense. This is not something we used to do at European level before, but I'm thinking new ways of financing, maybe common debt, maybe creative ways of pooling resources and identifying common industrial projects and capabilities that we want to invest in at the European level. So there's this sense of awakening. Today we're in a situation where Ukrainians have been defending themselves with extraordinary heroism and courage and defending their sovereignty and freedom. But we still see Russia making progress on the ground and keeping maximalist aims, escalating, bringing North Korean troops on the European continent. I mean, when you think about it, the change of paradigm that it represents to have North Korean troops on the European soil, Iranian drones and missiles that are being used against infrastructure, cities, civilians. And so when we talk about maybe tomorrow having a negotiation, President Zelensky has said that he's open to having a negotiation. It takes 2 to tango. And the one country that is not clearly signaling that it's open for negotiations is Russia. So the only way to put an end to the war is actually to increase the pressure on Russia and to make it understand that military victory is not possible. And so to continue to strengthen the hand of Ukrainians. That's for the midterm, I would say. I'm saying this because there's clearly no, as tragic as it sounds, there's no quick, easy fix to this situation. And then the other question, and goes directly to, the other point that goes directly to your question, is how do we ensure long-term deterrence? How do we ensure security guarantees for Ukrainians so that they can rebuild, so that they can anchor their country to Euro-Atlantic institutions, to democracy, because this is what it's about? And how do we make sure that we deter another potential aggression? And here, we'll have to have tough conversations in Europe about the role that we play in the security guarantees, but we're ready to do so, because once again, it is our security interest that's at stake, and it's the stability of the eastern flank of the continent. The key test of victory, I would say in this, for me, is whether Ukrainians are able to really turn to European democracy and develop and reform and fight against corruption and reform their state, their judiciary, so that they can, down the road, join the European Union. This is what it's about. I was first time in Ukraine in 2014 during the Maidan movement. I went there as a pro-European sort of sympathizer because for the first time in history, you had young kids being shot at because they were brandishing the European flag in protest, because for them it was the promise of a better future, of defense of liberty and anchoring democracy in their country. So this will be the ability to, get Ukrainians the future that they want, I think will be the long-term test of whether we succeed or not.
So we talked about Ukraine. If we try to characterize the project that Donald Trump is proposing, it's a project of disengagement from a number of international commitments from the US. It's a project of closing the borders to immigration, to the importation of goods by raising tariffs. But this is combined with some dose of imperialism. The Panama Canal, renaming the Gulf of Mexico, and something that is of closer interest, I guess, for Europe, which is Greenland, and potentially annexing Greenland. This is completely unbelievable to imagine an ally that is threatening the territorial integrity of a European country. And so, my question to you is, what should European response be to this, given that we are dealing with a president who has a new approach to international relations, an approach of making deals like you would do as a business person. And I wonder whether European integrity is at threat here, given perhaps our difficulty to provide a common, very clear response to this. Henry Kissinger, when he was Secretary of State, used to joke, who should I call if I want to call Europe? So are we at a disadvantage? What's exactly the risk? What are the odds that, in fact, Greenland, in 2 years from now, has an American flag on it?
You're completely right to underscore the importance of unity and a unified response. Because if we start going to Washington in bilateralized relations in a divided way, then we'll all lose. And this is something that goes for Greenland, is something that goes for the broader trade relationship with the US, as we've heard the threats of tariffs and a trade pressure. We're the largest trading bloc to each other. And Europe is 450 million people. It's a major unified market, although there's a lot more to unify it and integrate it. And a trade war and protectionism is in no one's interest. But, and I say this as a realist, the only way to convey that message is actually stay unified and to show that you can also retaliate and that you also have trade tools to be able to put pressure. We've been through this before because I remember in 2016, there was a lot of pessimism in Europe. We had Brexit, and people said Britain will divide Europeans. They've been doing this for 500 years, so they know how to play this. And short-term national economic interest will take precedent. It hasn't happened. Hasn't happened because there was a strong sense that we needed to preserve the integrity of the rules of the European Union, the single market, and the negotiation with Great Britain. And what we've seen is that this hasn't strengthened the anti-EU forces in Europe. It was quite the opposite, actually. Because it sort of reminded people what Europe was about and why leaving actually turned against the Brits. And same thing with the Trump administration. We also showed that we could retaliate in a potential trade war, and that's what led to a negotiation and to de-escalate. And the EU, largely pushed, I would say, in this direction by France, has got out of his naivete on commercial issues to a large extent in the last few years. We are able now to do things that we weren't able to do before. If you take just a couple months ago, the European Commission, after a pretty robust legal inquiry, decided to impose tariffs on the Chinese electric vehicles because it determined that China was subsidizing its electric vehicle sector. The Biden administration, by the way, had done so as well, imposed 100% tariffs. We imposed 35% tariffs. It's not as radical. But this was something that had been impossible a few years ago on solar panels, for example. But now you have Europeans basically saying, we want to trade, but we want a level playing field. So you need to implement the same rules than us. You need to have if we impose norms and standards to our companies or our farmers, it needs to be the same for our trading partners. If you have hidden subsidies, then we consider that it's not fair trade practices. And so now we're much more able to have a unified response because trade is, as you know, a competency of the European Commission. So this is something on which the Commission has sort of a monopoly. But of course, we debate and we discuss it with the Commission and say, okay, we need to be able to defend our interests. So it's going to be the same thing with the United States. Turbulences, pressures, tariffs are in no one's interest. But the best way to convey that message will be to stay united and show that we're able to respond. And that goes for Greenland. You need very clear principles. I mean, you cannot, especially among allies, question the territorial integrity of the borders of a sovereign state in Europe. And so in this respect, we had the Danish Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, was in Paris a few days ago. She met with President Macron. She was in Berlin the next day. We conveyed our support and solidarity, and we made sure to say that we'll stay united, and if one country is under specific pressure, you'll see a bloc around that country. We had the same thing, by the way. One of the cases where we developed these instruments in Europe was when Lithuania got under a lot of pressure from China because it was getting closer to, it started, I would say, upgrade its relationship with Taiwan. And here again, there was a temptation by China to sort of isolate Lithuania and put more pressure, and we managed to keep a united front. We're much stronger as a bloc, especially on these trade issues.
It's very good to hear this and to hear Europe's resolution not to let one of its member states have its territorial integrity being violated. You mentioned two different things. You mentioned on Ukraine the possibility of perhaps inviting that country to be a member of the European Union in the future. You also mentioned the need and the efforts that European countries are currently undertaking to reinforce the cooperation amongst them. And so my question to you is whether these two projects, on one hand, widen, on the other hand, deepen the construction, whether they are really compatible. Isn't there a tension between trying to reinforce the cooperation, including on domains that are still today the prerogative of the member states and not of the European Union, and on the other hand, extending to new countries that might have different interests, different perceptions and incentives on these dimensions?
That's a very old, almost theological debate in Europe, as you know. And to be frank, historically, the French were always kind of skeptical of enlargement, precisely because of this, because it was seen as diluting the decision-making process in Europe, making it too large to be able to carry clout and to stay unified. And I think, and we've come a long way from that, I think it made us miss really opportunities of engaging with new partners. If you look at the last big wave of enlargement 20 years ago, when you had countries of Central and Eastern Europe that had been left behind the Iron Curtain during the Cold War that joined, it was an extraordinary moment of reunification of the European family. It was a historic moment. If you allow me some, romanticism about what that meant, if you read Milan Kundera, he has this extraordinary essay called the Kidnapped West, where he talks about Central Europe, and he says for centuries it was the cultural heart of Europe, and then it's been left behind the Iron Curtain. So there was this, I think, reunification of Europe that is also what this project is about. But it's true that it does necessitate rethinking and putting more agility into our institutions. We've done so because more and more policies are at qualified majority rather than unanimity. But we'll clearly have to rethink some of the way our institutions work. But there's clearly, I think, now a pretty large consensus that enlargement is also about the geopolitical stability of the European continent, because we've left too many gray zones. We've left too many regions or countries prey to foreign interference, Russia or China. We work with Ilva on the Western Balkans as well, which is closer to Paris than Kyiv. It's also an economic opportunity, if you allow me to say so. I mean, it enlarged also the economic space and the single market of the European Union. It's of course an opportunity for the populations of these countries. These are long processes. They have to be merit-based. I say this because I'm often asked when I go to Ukraine, for example, when will Ukraine join the European Union? Will Ukraine be a member by 2030? And I always refuse to answer this because I say it depends on you. You need to undertake these long administrative and legal reforms. It's not a political decision where you push a button. In a way, the political decision's been made already. We've decided to recognize Ukraine as a candidate country, and I think that was a historic moment for Europe. Now it's a long process that will accompany, but we need to be able to do both at the same time. Reform, deepen, finish the single market. That means capital markets union, banking union, making sure that we have fewer frictions for companies that want to develop in Europe, that want to fund themselves in Europe. Basically everything that's contained in the Draghi report that shows all the obstacles and limits that you have to competitiveness and growth and investment at the European level. And at the same time, you need to be able to continue to push for enlargement. It's not an easy process, but I think both should be made priorities and go hand in hand rather than being seen as mutually exclusive.
So we have talked about the future of Europe. I would like to get your views about the future of the world order. If I had to summarize the history of the world order since 1945, it's the global liberal order with the US as the leader. Now the US is no longer willing to play that role, apparently. And there has been a lot of back and forth, for instance, on climate between Obama, who was one of the main artisans of the Paris Agreement, then Trump, who withdrew the US from the agreement, then Biden, who put the US back in the agreement, then Trump, who withdrew the US again. So, whatever the next administration is, the US doesn't look like a reliable partner for the world to collaborate on such issues. So, what should France and Europe's position be on matters such as climate? Should we accept that we have entered a new order in which each country is going to retract on its borders, in which this type of collaboration has come to an end? Or is Europe willing and in a position to play the role of the new leader of the global liberal order, in particular on the environment, in which a topic on which Europe has innovated a lot. Europe was one of the main areas making progress under the Kyoto Protocol. Europe had the first global trade market for carbon emissions. Europe was one of the first areas to invent and innovate again with border carbon adjustment, so putting tariffs on importations from countries that didn't have a tax on carbon that was as high as our local price. So is Europe on the environment and on other issues able to play the role of a new leader of the global liberal order?
I hope so. I think it's actually a very worthy ambition for us on multilateralism, on cooperation, or on the climate. First, because it's not because others have decided to reduce their ambition that we need to join this race. That's destructive for everyone. But beyond that, if you allow me also to say so, it's in our interest. Decarbonation will down the road allow us to reduce energy costs, because right now we're not like in the US, we import and we're much more dependent and have higher energy prices. So if we manage to invest in the electrification through renewables and through nuclear energy, and go to net zero, which is the objective, that will actually also make us more competitive and lower energy prices and much more sovereign, because less dependent also on other countries. So there's also a very good economic and strategic case to be made for Europe in this respect. The reason I'm saying this is because we are also in Europe facing a lot of backlash against environmental policies, against the Green Deal, everything that we've implemented. That doesn't mean that we can't put pragmatism in the way we implement this, because some of the norms may have been too stringent, and some of the companies are taking a longer time to adapt. And we've done this a lot through regulation rather than investment. So we also need to put the investment compound to this. But with keeping the targets and the ambition and the objectives, and yes, leading it at the global level. It's it's a tricky moment for Europeans because you need to have several brains at once. No organization more than the EU has thrived in sort of the liberal world order, end of history, 90s mindset. Global cooperation, norms, global public goods, multilateralism. And clearly now we're in an international environment that's much more conflictual, much more zero-sum, where the use of force, the integration of economic and national security instruments is much more assumed. And I was mentioning tariffs and trade instruments earlier. This is not something that we're used to. And this is not how we think about trade. I was struck, for example, I've mentioned this a couple times, Gina Raimondo, the former trade secretary, commerce secretary under the Biden administration, when she gave her farewell speech during the transition, she said, "I run a tech and national security agency." And I think in the 90s or in the 2000s, she would have talked about growth and free trade and jobs. And now she saw her mission as tech and national security. And Europeans are not there. You know, I don't think you'd hear, maybe things are moving, but you don't hear the Commerce Commissioner saying, you know, this is a DG of tech and national security. It's still about trade and trying to find a positive sum approach to relations with the rest of the world. And so we have this DNA, this software that's positive. That's how we work. I mean, European Union is extraordinary political success for Europeans. We've replaced centuries of war and nationalism with cooperation based on the rule of law and trade and shared sovereignty. But at the same time, we also need to understand that the rest of the world, at least the United States and China, don't function this way. And that doesn't mean that we need necessarily to accept it. And so I think working also to rethink multilateralism, to rethink global cooperation, also with the rest of the world and global actors, is going to be a huge challenge. When you think about international institutions, can they function the way they've been built after the Second World War? Do we need to rethink them completely, give, of course, more weight to new actors from the global south? I'm not a big fan of that expression, but you know what I mean. How do you also include the civil society, NGOs, corporations into reaching climate goals? President Macron has been pushing this a lot in the last few years, this sort of new wave of multilateralism where it's not just states working with each other, but sort of ad hoc coalitions that are willing, focused on specific issues like preserving the oceans or reaching environmental goals with lots of different actors, from philanthropists, NGOs, states, corporations. So I think that's also something on which Europeans can lead the way in rethinking global governance.
One fundamental factor of international relations is economic power. And a source of concern, I guess, as a French citizen, as a European citizen, is to see France and Europe falling behind the US. Since 2008, the US has continued growing, and we have plateaued. And so, of course, after 10, 15, 20 years, you start seeing the growing gap. And I guess that might be one of the reasons why the US is no longer considering Europe as a partner, at least as an equal partner. But you mentioned that you're an optimist. So are there any reasons for optimism on that front?
Before being an optimist, you have to be lucid about the challenges. There's an expression I like, it's pessimism of intelligence, optimism of the will. And you have to be very clear about the challenges that we're facing. And yes, we are falling behind. In the last 30 years, the United States has generated twice as much GDP per capita as Europe. In 2008, the GDPs of Europe and the United States were basically the same, and now we've lost 30%. And on critical areas for the future, like artificial intelligence, about 60% of world investment is going to the US, about 20% to China, and 6 or 7% to Europe. And as we know, this is not linear. It goes exponentially afterwards. The Draghi report, which I think it's almost a cliche to quote at this point, but I think it's really the most comprehensive roadmap to what needs to be done says that we have a shortage of public and private investment in Europe compared to the US of about 800 billion euros a year. And when I talk to, you think about tech, quantum, and AI, we have the talents, we have the startups, we have the entrepreneurs, we have lots of extraordinarily smart, talented people who want to take risk in Europe and ready to innovate, but it's complicated. When I talk to startups in France, even the ones that have raised money, that have already started being successful and recognized, and we have tons of them, especially in the sectors that I just mentioned, they still tell me that when they want to set up shop in Poland, in Germany, or in Italy, they feel that they're starting from scratch. Because new regulatory environment, new corporate law, different sources of financing, and your track record in France is not necessarily recognized in the other country. And so here, and clearly the sense of urgency and the pressure coming from what's happening in the United States and China, I think is something that we should use to push for what I was mentioning earlier, capital markets union, banking union. There's lots of ideas out there that need to be implemented. Enrico Letta, the former Italian prime minister, who's also been working a lot on these issues, made a proposal for, he basically says right now in Europe you have 27 corporate law systems. And they're the result of hundreds of years of judicial legal history. So creating just one, harmonizing all of this will be way too difficult. And you're going to have so many legal, institutional, cultural taboos to overcome. So why not just create a 28th one? A 28th one, and lots of think tankers and experts have actually started drafting one already, so it's already there. A 28th one, and any company can choose whether it wants to go to the national corporate law system or if it chooses the 28th one because it wants to export and wants to develop itself in Europe. And these are among the things that the Commission is working on right now. So I think there is this renewed sense of urgency to basically, and it goes, the list is long, from reforming the European Investment Bank so that it takes more risks. And it doesn't just act as a traditional commercial bank, but it allows to focus more on innovation and nascent companies. That we also have we talked about this earlier today, the ecosystems between, and I say this here at Harvard, between universities, the private sector, research better integrated in Europe and more competitive on the global scale. There's a lot to do, but it goes back to what we were saying earlier. If we look at what's happening in the United States, instead of just thinking, what is Trump going to say, what is Trump going to do, the answer is with us, is to focus on what we control, take matters into our own hand, focus on Europe, and here, the talent is there, even the capital is there. There's so much dormant savings. If you look at the figures, there's more capital that's just not being invested in Europe, that's just staying in bank accounts, not generating any interest, not generating any resources, or that's going to the United States. 300 billion a year is being invested in the stock markets in the United States, which could go to be invested in Europe. So on what we need for decarbonation, for tech, for defense, of course, I think that's going to be really absolutely critical that we take these economic steps and we reform to unleash the potential of this European single market and basically be, on equal standing with our partners.
Thanks a lot for all these comments. I would like to open the floor for questions from the audience. If you can please introduce yourself and then ask your question.
Yep. Hello, my name is Victoire Mandono. I'm the outgoing president of the Columbia European Union Student Association. Now I'm working at the Joint SDG Fund at the UN. My question is so when you wake up in the morning, you know what you want to do. And I'm wondering, so when you meant at the beginning, that European needed to wake up, I'm wondering, what's your vision of, of waking up? Is it kind of like the Gilets jaunes? Or is it something else? How if you in this conference, we talk a lot about, oops, sorry, I'm talking too long. I'll stop here.
No, go ahead.
Yeah, we talk a lot about like stakeholders, like it's always outside. Well, like we know that like we're doing politics because like we care about the people. So like how do we find an answer for the people to like how to what they should wake up and how is this wake up looking?
For me, when I say wake up, we talked about the economic dimension, we talked about defense. If I'm being frank, I think it's a more dangerous world, it's a more competitive world, and the question is, do we still want, we still have the appetite, Europeans, to play a role on the global stage, to be the masters of our destiny, to be sovereign? Or do we just accept to be a moment in history that's coming to an end and let other external countries, the United States, China, and others, decide our future when it comes to technology, decide our future when it comes to security, and be sort of just a passive theater of great power rivalries. I know it sounds very big picture and strategic when I say this. That's the broader aspect. You asked me what do I think about when I wake up.
Just like imagine we are all Europeans in the
Yeah.
We just wake up and like we're ready, like you're gonna give us a guideline and we're gonna follow it. How do we like transform Europe?
Okay.
We're waking up just now.
That's a very interesting question. I think that's more a question of it's almost a question of life advice. The only way not to become insane is to focus on what you control. Mm-hmm. And so you have the bigger picture, or you have what you care about, and then is to identify the actual leverage. It's very complicated. It's not an easy. You're asking me a very complicated question, but I think about this all the time in my position. Where can I, in my position, make a difference? You know, and that's sometimes negotiating certain texts with partners in Brussels. Sometimes it's trying to on the different areas that I just mentioned. Sometimes it's being vocal about this here or in the media and trying to get other people a little bit riled up and involved. But it's really, I think, about just whether it's on defense, whether it's on the economy, whether it's on reforming, and it can be through politics is one of them, but it could be through the private sector, it could be through NGOs, but I think just identifying the levers of influence that you can have to shape policy and shape the future is, I think, one of the ways to give meaning to the action, if that makes sense.
Yeah, thank you.
Hello, ministers. Thank you for your presentation. My name is Paul Demel. I'm a student at the Fletcher School at Tufts University and coming from HEC in Paris. You said that Europe is and can be a leader, especially in environmental topics. And you talked about the importance of being lucid in international affairs. Do you think that at the time when Switzerland is submitting a referendum at the federal level for limiting its economic and industrial development within the scope of planetary boundaries, and when European MPs are attacking the Green Deal, do you think that in Europe, both the people and the political sphere is lucid about what a world at +3, +4 degrees of global warming means?
Well, I think the people you're talking about are not lucid about what it means. Or at least there's this sort of game theory approach that, well, why would we do the efforts when others are not doing it? Because if we do it on our own, it doesn't change anything to the global climate dimension. I think that's an argument that you're going to hear more and more. This is why, by the way, you heard the argument I was making. I think it's also in our interest. You know, it's in our interest to decarbonate because it makes us less dependent and more competitive down the road, especially on energy prices. I think that's an argument to be made that Europe should do it. And Vincent was mentioning also that we have tools also to influence others, especially the carbon adjustment mechanism that basically says, well, you know, going back to having fair trade and level playing field is if our trading partners, say China, India, or others, don't respect the same kind of environmental norms and the same kind of decarbonation in their trade with us, then we'll make them pay and we'll tax them about it to rebound. So that's also a way to exert influence beyond our borders. But I would add something to your argument, to your question. It goes back to the debate we're having in France as well about simplifying some of the norms and procedures that we've imposed in the last few years and showing more pragmatism. Because I think it's really, I say this as an elected official, it's very important to, if we want to keep consensus and public support for these ambitions, which are necessary, it is important to make sure that they don't disproportionately target certain areas, certain parts of the population, that we're able to embark our population, that we accompany, that we invest, that we don't do it in a way that alienates people. I think it's very important. The person earlier mentioned the yellow jackets, and yellow jackets because we had the carbon tax, which was decided in Paris, but disproportionately affected people who were not in Paris. And in France, for example, if you take the yellow jacket, one piece of data that's absolutely fascinating is the biggest dividing line in the yellow jackets, like the thing that would determine the most whether you were a sympathizer or not of the movement, was whether you drove a car on a regular basis. And if you're Parisian, you don't drive a car. You take the metro, you walk, you Uber sometimes. A lot of people, a lot of ministers don't have a driver's license. And whereas in lots of areas in the country, you drive your kids to school sometimes for a long time. You need to drive for a long time to find the closest doctor. You need to drive for a long time to go to work. And so if you make decisions in ministerial staff in Paris, but you don't realize that it's actually unjustly affecting in a disproportionate way other categories of the population, then you're going to have backlash. I think this is why it's important to be pragmatic and smart about how we go about it. It's not an easy answer. Every country is going through the same debates. But for example, in France right now, actually all over Europe, we're having this absurd situation where we put important climate targets for the car industry. So basically by 2035 in Europe, you won't be able to sell véhicules thermiques, how do you say this? Combustion engines, yes, sorry. And but now because we have midway targets, basically 2025, 2026 that you need to achieve. And now we're in a situation where our car makers, because 2024 has not been a good year for electric vehicles, our car makers are asked to buy emission credits from Tesla and BYD in China, or otherwise they're going to lay off workers because they have to pay penalties imposed by the European Commission. So we've asked, and I've been among the ministers that have asked to suspend those penalties, because we're in a situation where you have to understand where it makes no sense. We're not going to subsidize the competitors of our car industry through this mechanism. So being pragmatic and being flexible in how we achieve it and accompanying the transition of the industry, invest and make it easier, for example, or tax deductible to buy electric vehicles, that's, I think, the way to go about it. So that, and it's a difficult debate, but it's a debate that we're going through right now. And this is why we need to be very vigilant about the backlash and take it seriously and find concrete solutions to it.
I'm resisting the envy to ask you for the list of members of government who don't have a driver's license, so that we can go to the next question.
Bonjour, Monsieur le Premier. Bonjour, Monsieur le Ministre. Apologies. So, I think you mentioned that Europe is going through this realization that it needs to become less dependent on the United States when it comes to guaranteeing European defense and security. But perhaps there's also been this realization that Europe has disproportionately benefited from passing its defense burden and security burden to the United States.
Yeah.
While the United States spends a lot on weapons, Europe doesn't have to, and maybe it can provide an efficient and plentiful welfare system. And so if now we will need to spend more on weapons, how are we going to convince the average European that they may have to pay more taxes, they may have to work a few more years, just because we need to spend more on weapons. So could you comment on whether you think there is a dilemma between defense and welfare, and what you think of that?
Yeah. First, not necessarily. I don't think so. I think a lot of our welfare systems need to be reformed and adapted, but for their own sake, not because of defense spending. If you take France, where we've been going through major debates over pension in the last few years, it's not so much because we need to pay elsewhere, but we have a redistribution system where workers pay the pensions of retirees that was set up at a time where you had basically 4 workers, 1 pensioner. Now you have about 1.5 workers for 1 pensioner. And of course, for good reasons, because people live longer. But now we have, on average, if I'm not wrong, probably the most or one of the most, the largest or longest retirement time spent in retirement in the OECD. And so it puts a lot of pressure on the system that's a deficit. So every European country basically has taken the decision to work a little longer and go to 64, 65, 67. So we've been going through, and it's not completely over, but we've been going through an intense debate over pensions. So reforming and adapting our social systems, I think, will be part of the conversation in any case. But on defense, and this is going to be the crux of a big transatlantic conversation. It's been the case for the last few years, but it will continue in the next few years. I think one of the best way to make the case in Europe is also to show that when you increase defense spending and you spend on the military, it also trickles down in investments and jobs and factories being opened in the United States. And the reason I'm saying this, because this is a big debate between France and the US actually, is the question of European taxpayer money being sent to support the European defense industry. Because we're going to see some pressure in the next few years to buy American hardware and to say, well, if you want the American military protection, you need to buy American weapons. If you want to make the case in a sustainable way that Europe needs to increase its defense spending and needs to be more self-reliant, which is a legitimate request, then you also need to understand that it needs to also support and sustain the European industry, because it's about keeping the technological know-how, it's about creating jobs and growth in Europe. So that's going to be a big debate, but here the French have a very strong attachment to the question of a European preference for European defense spending.
Thank you.
We have time for one final and hopefully excellent question.
Bonsoir, Monsieur le Ministre. I think the moderator is being polite because I used to be one of his students. My name is Philip Rival. I'm a graduate of the business school class of 23, and I'm actually a French founder who chose to stay in the US to start my company. One of the reasons being it took me half the time to raise twice the capital. Yeah. And I actually had an SAS ready and an American equivalent. But in the States, opening the company is done in a day. And like every American startup, I'm a Delaware C Corp. But I could work in Massachusetts straight away. In France, I would need a tribunal to approve it. And then I don't know if I could work in other European countries. You mentioned about coordination at the startup level earlier in your speech. I'm curious if there's any thought to like a European-wide startup status or something where for the first few years we don't really care what you are, because a Delaware C Corp is basically a template for almost everybody now. Yeah. And in Europe, at the early stage, founders don't really want to care about the admin. They want to be like, can this survive, and not have to deal with that. That's a bit of a wild idea, but I'd love to know your thoughts.
Yeah, I can maybe take another question afterwards, because the short answer is yes. That's among also the project we're looking at. We want to create a status that's called Young Innovative Company. And that precisely goes to the direction that you're mentioning. And I would say beyond just this status, something I should have mentioned is simplify the rules. So much bureaucracy, so much regulation and norms, a lot of them for good reasons, good purposes, but have actually sometimes end up being completely counterproductive and much more of an administrative burden, especially for the small and medium companies that just don't have the the time and the resources to be able to comply with all the rules. So simplification in general, but especially for this new status for startups, is going to be a huge part of what we're trying to do.
The very final question then.
Thank you for taking my question. My name is Maria Georgieva. I'm an undergraduate at Harvard College from Bulgaria. And my question is continuing the topic of defense, and is mainly oriented on the fact that during the European elections in June 2024, a lot of parties went on a campaign and a promise of maybe a unified European Security Council or a unified European army. But currently, the legislation is designed in such a way that it vests the majority of these decisions on the national government. Mm-hmm. So how are the EU bodies planning on going about this legislative challenge in order to administer all of the ideas that you shared and that are going to secure your defense on the continent?
Well, there's a deeper philosophical debate behind your question because, I think everyone knows this debate, but in the 1950s, there was the debate over the common European defense, which was rejected by the French National Assembly in an alliance between the Gaullists and the communists. And the purpose at the time was almost to basically merge together the French and German armies. And there was big backlash. It was just a few years after the war, and it was very ambitious, but there was big backlash from French public opinion and French politics. And so this is why afterwards we went through the coal and steel community, much more intergovernmental and sort of cooperation on more technical, I would say, areas. And today at the European Council, defense and security are still at unanimity. This is why, by the way, we always go through these negotiations with Hungary and others over renewal of sanctions. We just went through this last week on Russia. And it frustrates some who say, it should be much more federalized, it should be qualified majority. I have to say I'm not a federalist. I think that on certain areas, and especially the military, especially the decision of who you send to war, at the end of the day, I don't see how you can do something else than do it at the national level. I don't see tomorrow a president of the European Commission making decisions for troops of different countries. That doesn't mean, however, that you cannot do much more than we're doing now. To find common financing instruments during COVID, we considered rightly so that we were facing an existential crisis for Europe, and we managed to overcome a big taboo, which was common debt, and we borrowed 750 billion euros for the recovery of the European continent at the European level. I would argue that what's happening in Ukraine and the broader pressure on Europe today is also existential for our continent. And so let's pool resources. Let's have common debt. Let's invest together on weapons. Let's agree on what we want to do, to defend, to continue to support Ukraine and to defend ourselves and to be less dependent on others. Let's invest in common industrial projects. So I think there's a lot to do without necessarily thinking of sort of a federalized or unified European army, which I think would create a lot of backlash, I think, in many countries.
Thank you.
So I believe that a few words will be said to conclude the day, but for now, please join me in thanking Minister Haddad for being with us today.